A very warm welcome to you all joining us this evening for this, our third talk in the Art Within Cathedrals series that we've been putting on. My name's Laura Moffat and I'm the Director of Art and Christianity. For those of you who aren't our regular members or know about our organisation, we hope you might be able to take a few moments to look at our website and see what we do. One of the things we do is to publish a journal that we produce quarterly, and that goes out to all our members. We also work with artists. We've got an exhibition just opening on Monday in Leytonstone in East London, and we put on events like this pretty regularly. So we hope we might see you again, perhaps at a future event. I'll just run through a couple of, well, more than a couple actually, of just practical details. You probably all know this already, but if you could keep yourself on mute, please, during the talk. It also does help if you turn your videos off during the talk, just in terms of distraction, but it also frees up the bandwidth for us. If you can use the chat function to type your questions, if you have questions for James as he's speaking, we don't mind if you do that during the talk, that's fine. We can have a look at those questions then at the end, and we'll certainly have time to pass some of those questions through to James for him to answer. We are recording this talk this evening so that we can put it online for others to see after the event. But of course, it makes a real difference to have people with us. So thank you for buying a ticket to be with us this evening live as we go ahead with this. One other last little technical detail, it does help if you've got speaker view chosen as your view for the window panes there. That just will mean that you can see James only as he begins his talk and presents his slides. So just remains for me to introduce James, and I'm really pleased to have him with us. James is kind of new to our organisation, I think, but it's really nice to make contact with him. James is an architectural historian and he's the secretary at the Historic Churches Committee for Wales and Herefordshire. I was recently directed to a BBC report on Shrewsbury Cathedral, Roman Catholic Cathedral, where James had been commenting on some really interesting 19th century wall paintings that have been uncovered recently. And perhaps I just throw this out, maybe you might give us a little talk on Shrewsbury at some point. That would be fabulous. But I think it's early days in terms of recovering those wall paintings. So I think without further ado, we'll ask James to speak to us on this unusual cathedral. I think many of us won't know Salford Cathedral well, if at all. So we're really delighted that you can bring this to our attention this evening. And over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Firstly, a big thank you to Art and Christianity and yourself, Laura, and as well Marie O'Grady, first for the invite and for facilitating this talk. It's a great opportunity and a privilege for me. So I hope that you find it an engaging subject to be committing some of your time to this evening. It would have been much nicer in the flesh, but maybe a few more months' time we might actually be at that point where we can have those meetings again. So, as you know, my name is James Crowley. I'm a freelance architectural historian, as Laura has said, and yes, I'm secretary of the Historic Churches Committee for the three Welsh dioceses, the three Catholic Welsh dioceses. I'm also a member of Salford Cathedral's Fabric Committee and the Project Planning Board, so it's particularly apt that I should be speaking about the cathedral today. But as well as that, I'm a Salfordian and a practicing Catholic, so who are they going to get to talk about the place, perhaps? So St John's is actually my local cathedral. I'm still a resident of Salford, so I speak this evening on a subject that's, of course, very close to my own heart. As you know, the topic this evening is Salford Roman Catholic Cathedral, a Hidden Identity. When asked if I would like to deliver the talk to Art and Christianity on Salford, I was delighted, as it seems to me a fascinating building that makes an ideal subject with which we can look at the relationship between art and faith, as well as raising awareness of the diversity of art in our churches through the study of this particular cathedral. While I know the cathedral very well and have been involved there professionally for the last 5 years, I did ponder the angle for the talk but the term a hidden identity is one that struck me quite forcefully. The meaning of the title is twofold in the sense of Salford being a lesser known cathedral, as Laura alluded to, i.e. it's not Anglican, nor is it medieval, nor is it on the tourist trail as yet, but hopefully we can change that. As well as in the sense of its appearance and significance having been gradually hidden during the course of its existence. Such major churches often remain at least local landmarks with seemingly little external change over the decades, in contrast to the townscape and surrounding skyline, which is seemingly ever-changing. Yet certainly with Catholic cathedrals and churches, it is so often the case that radical change internally leave us with a building that is somewhat far removed from the architectural and artistic cohesion of its original or early state, when the language of the building and the significance of its decoration was best understood. And that is certainly very true of Salford. So the object of my talk is to present the cathedral to you and to show you how it's changed over the years. But the crux of my talk is to try and demonstrate just how fundamental the aesthetic quality of the building was to the identity of the Catholic community that built it and subsequently worshipped within. I'll seek to explain how these changes over time have diminished the significance of the cathedral and how it is understood, weakening the historic identity of the worshipping community, before looking at how these aspects might be recovered. I do apologise, I can't quite get rid of the bar at the top. I hope you're not seeing it. The Cathedral Church of St John the Evangelist is situated on Chapel Street, the A6, one of the main routes into Manchester city centre from the west. For those of you that do not know the area, Manchester and Salford form a conurbation, with the two centres separated by the River Irwell, which further downstream becomes the Manchester Ship Canal. The city centre of Manchester, seen here as directed by my cursor, within the Ring Road, is immediately adjacent, as I say, to the old town of Salford, just across the opposite bank of the River Irwell. The cathedral is marked with the red pinpoint just here, and the actual old town of Salford is just about in this area. So the cathedral is located almost centrally within the historic town centre of Salford and stands as the predominant church of any denomination in this locale. The other map here on the right side of the screen shows its central location within the local conservation area, the cathedral precinct marked in black within the red border of the local conservation area. The old town hall of Salford is actually just a stone's throw from the cathedral, which is just here. And the nearest Anglican church, St Philip's, is in this location just here. These views show the cathedral from Chapel Street to the south. The cathedral is actually orientated south to north, but when I refer to its west front and east end and north and south transepts, I will be referring to the liturgical orientations. The neighbouring St Philip's Anglican Church previously mentioned is just about here where the cursor is circling now. Though a landmark in itself, St Philip's Church it is somewhat overshadowed by the cathedral. The local historic Church of Sacred Trinity, also Anglican and dating from around the 17th century, is somewhat tucked away and on a much more modest scale further down Chapel Street and well out of shot. It's to the east along Chapel Street over this side to the cathedral. But this prominent urban location is very unusual for a Catholic cathedral or church. Typically, they occupy lesser sites on the edge of town centres due to being relatively recent in date and built with limited funds for what was typically an impoverished working class community. Liturgical orientation matching geographic orientation was less essential as the buildings had to conform to the restrictions of whatever site could be acquired. But fortunately, the cathedral has a particularly good location with a clear approach from the thoroughfare. The liturgical north side and east end are fairly free of obstruction, and modern developments around about were constructed in recent decades with views of the cathedral given good consideration. These images show the north side, which has a very generous green space beside it, and the impressive east end at dusk, with some early 1990s civic artwork reflecting the verticality of the building. At this point, it's necessary to give a little background as context to how the cathedral came to be built. As many will be aware, from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Catholic worship in Britain was illegal for a period of over 200 years. Active priests and those determined to practice their faith in secret faced legal consequences, from fines to imprisonment, torture or execution. Although a little respite came during the reign of King James II, these penal laws, which had attempted to eradicate the Catholic faith from these isles, remained in place until the 19th century, and only began to be repealed towards the end of the 18th century, largely due to the Jacobite cause having dissipated. In these times, typically the only place Mass was said would be in the homes of landed Catholic families, known as recusants, whose faith was practiced in secret. Two such locations are these: Wardley Hall in Salford, seen here on the left, the official home of the bishops of Salford for a number of decades now, and Trafford Hall, seen here on the right, in Trafford. Now long since demolished, this is Trafford Hall, but it was the ancestral home of the de Trafford family. Around the same time in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the towns of Manchester and Salford were fast developing into one of the world's first industrial cities. The population growth, as with that of many in the industrial cities of the time, being fed by migration, workers from the surrounding regions, but also further afield, especially from Ireland, in particular during the years of the Great Irish Famine in the 1840s and 50s. Practically all of the Irish immigrants, of course, were Catholic. The most significant event for the Catholic community at that time was the Act of Catholic Emancipation in 1829. This lifted the last major restrictions to Catholic worship and life, crucially, including restrictions on the building and appearance of Catholic places of worship. Emancipation was the catalyst to what St. John Henry Newman would refer to as the Second Spring in his famous sermon of 1852, when describing the revival of the Catholic faith in England at the time. What had been a mere handful of individual adherents to what seemed to many non-Catholics an antiquated faith was fast growing into a vast worshipping community within 2 or 3 generations. Migration and Catholic emancipation had the combined effect of rapid growth in the local Catholic population, also seen in other industrial towns of Britain. But locally, the figures are truly remarkable. In the 60 years between 1777 and 1837, the Catholic population of Manchester grew from barely 20 individuals to over 60,000. That's 60,000 Catholics in just 60 years. For much of this period, Mass was said either in domestic chapels of the local recusant families, such as the examples already seen, or in garrets and rented premises in the town centre, or in modest chapels that were beginning to be established. By the 1830s, though, there were just 4 Catholic chapels that had been established, serving this huge community of 60,000 individuals. Being built while some of the penal laws were still in place, the chapels were restricted in their design. They could not be church-like in appearance, with no steeples or bells. Generally, they were modest buildings externally, non-conformist in appearance, but internally some had quite handsome altars and decoration, such as good altarpiece paintings. None of the 4 original chapels survive today, sadly, having been rebuilt or replaced, but the image here on the left shows a sketch of one of them, perhaps the most famous one, St. Mary's Mulberry Street, which is in central, or was in central Manchester. On the right is a view of the rebuilt church as seen today, or a couple of years ago now, and which is now affectionately known as the Hidden Gem, probably the most famous church in the diocese, after the cathedral, of course. Often the target of vandalism in savage acts of anti-Catholic violence, the low-key, almost defensive appearance of these early chapels is now easily understood. Given the size of the Catholic community in Manchester and Salford, there was a desperate need for more space. So in 1835, the original chapel of St Mary's, Mulberry Street here, underwent building works to extend. As a result of unsuitable work, the roof collapsed upon completion, leaving the chapel then in need of total reconstruction, and the Catholic community in the dire position of being without one of its 4 chapels. A decision was quickly made to both rebuild St Mary's and to erect a new large church. Eventually, a site in Salford, already partially occupied by a recently established Catholic school, was selected. This was the location of St John's Cathedral today. Augustus Pugin had originally been appointed for the design of St John's, but he resigned the commission before work began in 1842, apparently after a disagreement on some point of principle. There is speculation this was over the management of the contract, but my own theory is that it was likely to be over Pugin's typical insistence on a rood screen being part of the design. This was actually a point of dispute with another local Catholic church being built soon after this period by Pugin in Hume in Manchester, which was constructed between 1839 and 42. The rood screen was installed and it was actually ripped out within 10 years because it wasn't appropriate, so the authorities felt at the time. Instead, another Catholic architect, Matthew Ellison Hadfield of Wakeman and Hadfield in Sheffield, was appointed. These drawings here are from Hadfield's own scheme. The exterior on the left is largely as the cathedral was built and remains today, although the interior is principally different as no rood screen was ever installed at St John's, and there have always been pews. Perhaps Hadfield didn't get the memo about the rood screen, which Pugin clearly got. The building was in sharp contrast to the small, discreet chapels that had been in use at that time. Initially, the brief was for a large church. At the time, there were no Catholic dioceses, only districts under vicars apostolic. The Catholic hierarchy of dioceses, bishops, and cathedrals was only restored in 1850. However, it would seem that the church authorities had a growing sense of this impending restoration of the hierarchy. Building work began in 1844 with the foundation stone laid by Bishop James Sharples, coadjutor to the Vicar Apostolic of the Lancashire district. But during construction, a decision was made to lengthen the church, providing a choir within the building's footprint, and crucially, making the building cruciform in plan. This was a possible indication that the church was considered to be a potential future cathedral. The funds for the construction were raised from amongst the faithful, from the poor, working class, as well as the few with adequate means, including the local landowning Catholic families whose ancestors had fearlessly kept the faith alive by providing secret chapels during penal times. There were, however, 2 principal donors to St John's, Daniel Lee and John Leeming, both entrepreneurs in the local textile industry. They each established chantry chapels within the church. Although completed in 1848, the Diocese of Salford was only established in 1850, so the formal dedication of St John's as a cathedral would not occur until 1855, after further fitting out and decoration as the cathedral church. Designed in the decorated Gothic style, St John's appears to be the first Catholic church built since the Reformation to be cruciform in plan, and when complete, the 240-foot spire was the tallest in Lancashire. 2 features that seem to make a bold statement for the Catholic Church at that time, considering the clandestine manner in which they had worshipped in the preceding decades. The plan here is from the 1980s, but it shows the cruciform plan, with a baptistry located in the northwest corner, north and south transepts, a choir and sanctuary at the east end, beyond which is the Lady Chapel in the centre, with flanking chantry chapels either side. For influence, Hadfield drew major inspiration from the medieval churches of Howden Minster, in particular for the west front, Selby Abbey for the east window tracery, the sanctuary and choir, and St Mary Magdalene's, Newark, for the tower and spire. So those of you who are eagle-eyed church visitors might notice 1 or 2 slight similarities with those churches. The entrance to the choir and sanctuary beyond, seen here on the right, was flanked by statues of Our Lady and the Infant Christ to the left, just here, and St. John the Evangelist, patron of the church, to the right. Beyond the canon's choir stalls, just here, and then the bishop's throne or cathedra on the left, seen here. At the far end is the high altar, each of these fixtures being part of the 1855 fitting out. There were no fixed altar rails installed at the front of the choir, providing an uninterrupted view of the high altar. This was a particularly unusual feature of Catholic Church in the day. The decorated Gothic style of the church is in harmony with the ideals of Pugin, of whom Hadfield was a follower, but it is described as archaeologically eclectic due to the reworking and amalgamation of details from other churches into one overall design. Not a methodology that Pugin would take. On the face of it, it seems to be a sort of architecture by numbers approach, although the overall design is one of great accomplishment with a real sense of harmony and proportion. These are a few historic views of the interior to give a sense of the quality of the decoration. This image shows the choir and sanctuary with bishop's throne or cathedra with the ornate canopy to the left, just seen here. The canopy was carved out with elaborate tracery and was decorated with the armorials of the former bishops of the diocese. Although Gothic revival in style, the cathedral incorporated major features that were typical of what's known as the Counter-Reformation theories of church planning developed by St. Charles Borromeo following the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, and more commonly associated with Baroque churches. Planning is arranged with the central focus upon the tabernacle in the high altar, where the Blessed Sacrament or consecrated bread is reserved. This results in naves and aisles that provide uninterrupted or very good views of the sanctuary, and the throne above the tabernacle used for exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. While the building is largely archaeologically correct, the main feature, which is the fixture of central importance, the high altar, followed these Counter-Reformation theories, a most Catholic feature. This grand, intricate, pinnacled structure of carved cornerstone and marble stood some 34 foot high. It was designed by George Goldie, later partner with Hadfield and Wakeman, and was carved by Lane and Lewis of Birmingham, who also sculpted all the decorative stonework, including the altars of the chantry chapels and statues of the choir. It served as the altar for Mass with the splendid reredos with carved statues of the four evangelists. It incorporated the tabernacle where the Blessed Sacrament or consecrated bread is kept. Above this was the benediction throne, where the monstrance, an ornate metal receptacle used to exhibit the Blessed Sacrament for adoration, could be placed for exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. So here is the tabernacle just here, the benediction throne above, and the recess for the monstrance to sit. And here we have the four evangelists, two either side. The top of the pinnacle is just about here. Because it was very light lacework, the view through the canopies was actually quite good. You can actually see part of the windows visible just here behind the heads of the statues. This shows the view towards the Blessed Sacrament in the south transept, which I will mention in a moment, but the pulpit is also visible on the right, seen here. It was constructed like the altar of carved stone with marble supports and timber stair and canopy. The stonework had carved reliefs of scenes from the life of St. John the Evangelist. It was also the work of Lane of Lewis of Birmingham. The statue seen here on the left is the one of St. John the Evangelist at the entrance to the choir. Here is the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. Located in the south transept, it's shown here as it was originally and seen here today. The chapel was actually a later addition and dates from 1884, and was designed by Peter Paul Pugin, the youngest son of Augustus Pugin. The carved marble altar and reredos is the work of Robert Lockwood Bolton. They depict Eucharistic emblems and the pelican in her piety. The pelican is this tiny detail just above this tabernacle here. This is a common theme of Catholic churches with medieval origins. The shedding of the bird's own blood for her brood, symbolic of Christ's own passion and the Eucharist. The altar just underneath contains an effigy and relics of Saint Aurelius, who was Bishop of Carthage in the 5th century and companion of Saint Augustine of Hippo. These were brought back from Rome by Bishop Herbert Vaughan, the second Bishop of Salford. I do apologise. The painted scenes seen here in the colour photograph on the panelling are by Joseph Aloysius Pippet, an artist with Hardman's of Birmingham at the time, responsible for numerous church wall paintings of the period. The panels depict scenes of the joyful, sorrowful and glorious mysteries of the Rosary. The Blessed Sacrament is now reserved in the tabernacle where the original high altar was located. However, this chapel is used for daily mass. The large painting over the altar in the black and white photograph, this huge painting with the very ornate canopy, it depicts the Holy Trinity. It was removed in the 1930s and sadly was lost. What is remarkable is that in such a short space of time, the Catholic community had gone from worshipping in discreet, unassuming chapels to courageously constructing such large and conspicuous urban churches as St. John's, in all its Gothic revival splendour. While the Gothic revival was largely a revival of the art and architecture of the Middle Ages, for the prominent Catholic leaders of it, especially Augustus Pugin and his followers, it was a revival of Catholic Christian architecture and tradition intended to reflect a return to the Catholic Christian virtues of that period. The style, appearance, scale and decoration of the cathedral was clearly intended not just to provide a beautiful and fitting place for Mass, designed in the fashionable style of the day. The whole design of St. John's as the principal Catholic church for the region was to be a demonstration of the Catholic faith, re-establishing Catholic identity, showing continuity with the pre-Reformation church. Although suspicion and prejudice would continue for generations, the tremendous sense of freedom brought by emancipation to this rapidly growing community gave Catholics the confidence to practice their faith openly, to re-establish their heritage and demonstrate their legitimacy. It was through such buildings that they recovered their Catholic identity. The second spring was beginning to bloom. There is perhaps at this stage a sense of, but what happened? As is apparent from these images here, the cathedral underwent considerable change from its earlier form. Following the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965, all new churches were designed so the priest would face the congregation during Mass, and the spatial planning generally centred on the desire to gather the congregation closer and in some cases around the sanctuary and altar. Where existing churches stood, these liturgical changes often led to reordering, now a term synonymous with radical adaptation, often imposing modern liturgical and architectural ideas upon often historic churches of any style. Unfortunately, this coincided with the absolute low point of appreciation of Victorian architecture. St. John's had suffered some damage during the Second World War, which had led to the interior being repainted extensively, covering stenciling and the blue painted vaulting of the choir and sanctuary with its painted silver stars, what must have been an absolutely beautiful feature of the church. Following this, the cathedral then underwent reordering between 1971 and 72. The sanctuary was relocated into the crossing with a new modern altar of Botticino marble and an interesting suspended corona added. The architects were Cassidy and Ashton of Manchester. You can see here a close-up of the modern altar with the corona. This ambo is actually a slightly later addition. But generally, aside from the repainting, as I say, it's a fairly light touch. So many reorderings, this is a particularly light touch as reorderings go. And while stylistically the fixtures were modern, their introduction had not come at the loss of historic features. In fact, only the Blessed Sacrament chapel railings and the statue pinnacles at the front of the choir were removed. The statues remain to this day. It is achieved It achieved the goal of bringing the altar closer to the congregation and allowed worshippers to sit on three sides, in the nave and in both transepts. While capacity had been reduced with the loss of pews from the crossing, this was perhaps less of an issue as the local Catholic population was beginning to reduce, with local clearances of 19th century terraced housing in the immediate vicinity and people moving to the suburbs. It was following the reordering of the cathedral that it was then listed Grade 2 star in 1980. After the papal visit by John Paul II in 1982, there are a number of additions. The celebrant's chair and prie-dieu from the papal mass were installed. Also installed were a pair of studies in ink seen here on the left and right, and a central portrait of Pope John Paul, now St. John Paul II. Each of these three were by the Salford artist Harold Riley and are on view still in the cathedral. Unfortunately, despite the listing in only 1980, the cathedral underwent a further second reordering between 1985 and 88. This was both extensive and damaging. While the crossing sanctuary had only minor alterations with a new ambo and cathedra installed, many original features were removed. The high altar and elaborate reredos, the par-closed screens of the choir and baptistry and pulpit were dismantled and apparently smashed. The carved oak cathedra canopy was broken up, the choir stalls repurposed elsewhere, and the Stations of the Cross replaced. The statues and the spandrels of the choir arcade that were the only remnant of the original painted features were whitewashed. The objective seems to have been to focus attention upon the crossing sanctuary altar, with the great east window merely serving as a colourful backdrop. This is quite evident when walking around the cathedral, as the views eastwards show an almost bare interior compared to what had been before. However, the ornate Blessed Sacrament chapel in the south transept remained intact, as did the north transept and its War Memorial Chapel. So here we are with the interior today. Despite the whitewashed and sparse appearance, there is still much beauty in the cathedral, as I think is shown in these images of the nave and more especially the sanctuary in the great east window. The vaulting of the sanctuary and choir and the carved statues in the spandrels are very high quality. The statues seen just here in their canopies. The chantries and Lady Chapel with their ornate sculpture escaped the hammer and chisel, as too the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. They provided a tantalizing glimpse of the splendour of the building's former state. Also shown is part of the mosaic floor of the choir, originally by Minton, and here is a close-up of one of the panelled doors from the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. The floor was extensively repaired after the war through fire because of fire damage, and actually bears the coat of arms of Pope Pius XII, who was Pope during the war and at the time of the restoration. But at the east end of the cathedral, you really do get a sense of the quality of the craftsmanship that went into all of the sculpture and the stained glass in the cathedral. The north transept too is still quite original, with the War Memorial Chapel here on the right, where over 600 names of men from throughout the diocese who were killed in World War I are commemorated, as well as the beautiful Holy Rosary altar, an often missed beautiful little feature within the cathedral, and the original rood cross, now fixed to the north wall of the north transept. The Holy Rosary altar was formerly located in the south transept until the construction of a confessional block in 1951. Installed in 1886, the altar and reredos are of painted carved stone and timber, with painted panels depicting Our Lady of the Rosary and numerous saints representing the dedications at each of the parish churches within the diocese at that time. The decoration is most probably by Joseph Pippet. The rood cross is of carved oak with a painted corpus and gold leaf decoration, and there are symbols of the four evangelists at each of the terminals. It is the work of César de Jong of Bruges and created for the dedication of the cathedral. Carved fleur-de-lis details were removed from the terminals of the crucifix when it was relocated from the Arch of the Crossing to this part of the north transept, quite simply because otherwise it was too tall to fit on the wall. This was removed to here at the time of the reordering in the 1980s. This just here is part of the Bishop Sharples Memorial, also in the North Transept. It has a carved stone effigy of Bishop Sharples holding a model of the cathedral and lying within a canopied sepulchre. He's likely to have been carved also by Lane and Lewis of Birmingham. And a reminder, it was Bishop Sharples who laid the foundation stone of the cathedral back in 1844. As is apparent from these images, the cathedral has undergone drastic change from its earlier form, with many of the most ornate fixtures and decoration being removed. Though this is now largely as the cathedral remains today, I think it is only with the passage of these last few decades and with the rediscovery of the appreciation of church art and architecture of the Victorian period that many can begin to recognise what a drastic and detrimental loss had occurred. The loss of these ornate and highly significant fixtures and decorations not only diminishes the aesthetic quality of the cathedral, it has robbed the building of its true identity. There are some that regard such drastic adaptation as almost on a par with the destruction of Catholic churches in the periods following the Reformation, when all trace of the faith and the Catholic identity were trying to be eradicated. There is one difference, however. This time it was Catholics who were carrying out the destruction themselves. I think such destructive reorderings in the sake of modernising has diminished the heritage of the Catholic Church. The efforts of this liberated community in the 19th century to try and re-establish the link to the pre-Reformation Church has in some ways been undone. The heritage of the community today that had been evident in the decoration of the cathedral has become clouded and risks being forgotten, but its traces are still there. In 2016, the cathedral was awarded the first of 2 grants from the government's First World War Cathedral Centenary Cathedral Repairs Fund. As part of this, there was research into the importance of the War Memorial Chapel. There followed further research of the whole cathedral, looking at how it has changed over time and trying to establish the details and authorship of some of the features, such as the remaining decoration, the fixtures and stained glass windows, etc. Thankfully, that is how it's been possible to chart these changes over the decades. During the research, the importance of some of the aspects of the cathedral started to become clearer. Research into the painted decoration and stenciling provided a fascinating detail. On the spandrels of the crossing arch was a painted lineage. Initially, the names of the first 4 bishops were identified, seen here just on the left side, and in the smaller picture, it's this side of the arch. But on closer inspection, I could make out the legend just here, which reads Bishops of Mercia. This was later the Diocese of Lichfield. Underneath, and it was the Diocese of Lichfield that covered the area that Salford is now in during the medieval period. Underneath are the names of the first 4 bishops of Mercia, beginning in the 7th century. This lineage actually continued onto the spandrels of the nave arcades and appears to trace the direct line of succession from the 7th century through the penal times to the 20th century. So it starts at this side here and continues on these spandrels towards the back. It comes down here and up. Here are a list of the first 4 bishops of Salford and the first bishops of Mercia. This was remarkable to see. It was a clear demonstration of the heritage and legitimacy of the Catholic Church. Again, another bold and confident statement from a community in the 19th century that had in the previous generations known the oppression of the penal times. Perhaps the most obvious artistic demonstration of the identity of the Catholic community, but unknown, because quite simply it had been painted out after World War II. After the lineage was painted out, the armorials of the first bishops of Salford at that time were added to the windows of the nave aisles, so at least some sort of continuity in decoration was made. The armorials were by the local manufacturer George Ragg, who was also based on Chapel Street. They are likely to be the firm responsible for the whole of these windows installed in the early 20th century. The armorials shown here are of Bishop William Turner, the first Bishop of Salford, on the right, and Bishop Herbert Vaughan, the second Bishop of Salford. Perhaps the most striking major feature of the cathedral now, the Great East Window, is from 1854. It was the gift of the first Bishop of Salford, William Turner. Fortunately, it remains intact. It had been placed in storage for safety during the Second World War. By William Wales of Newcastle, the window is one of the finest 19th century windows of any Catholic church in the country. It depicts Christ seated in glory at the top. Above the holy sacrifice of the Mass is being offered for the souls in purgatory. Below that, it portrays Our Lady Help of Christians, seen here on the top row, unusually dressed in red. She is flanked by the saints Edward, Alban, Augustine, Thomas Becket, St. Bede the Venerable, and Benedict Biscop. Interestingly, Benedict Biscop holds a model of the tracery of the window. Below them is St. Gregory the Great in the centre. He is flanked by Saints Hilda, Margaret of Scotland, Helena, Ursula, Winifred, and Walburg. All the saints, of course, are pre-Reformation and familiar to those in the medieval church. This was a common occurrence with Gothic Revival stained glass, not only as the themes were appropriate to this most ancient craft, it reinforces the idea of connecting the church of the present day to the worship, in this case, the worshipping community of the 19th century, to the church in the first millennium and the Middle Ages. The saints serving as holy examples of Christian virtue and a part of the same Catholic community. At the very bottom of the window are these series of panels. This shows the glory of the church in England. In the centre, Our Lady seated holds the cathedrals of Lichfield and York. Lichfield, of course, being the diocese that covered this area before the Reformation, and York Minster representing the centre of the Apostolic Vicariate of the Northern District, which Salford then came under from 1688 to 1840. From left to right, the scenes show the conversion of King Ethelbert by St. Augustine in 597, then King Henry II doing penance at the tomb of St. Thomas of Canterbury, just here, in 1174. King Richard I departing for the Crusades and giving charge of the country to the bishops of Ely and Durham, just here. And then to the right of Our Lady, King Henry VIII denying the authority of the church in the presence of Cardinal Campeggio, the papal legate. Followed by a scene of persecution of the faithful in penal times, just here. And then lastly, on the extreme right, is the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England by Pope Pius IX in 1850. Interestingly, the original theme was intended to be the Tree of Jesse, continuing this idea of lineage and the ancestry of the church, but this was rejected for fear that the less literate worshippers would not understand the theme. The result of this decision, though, is that the window today is both breathtaking in its beauty and a highly significant artifact of Catholic heritage. Another feature of the cathedral that was not fully understood and that the worshipping community were unaware of is this collection of relics. Within the cupboards of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel is the cathedral's large collection of relics. Typically fragments of bone from the remains of saints or items that belonged to or were associated with them that are kept in major churches and cathedrals for veneration by the faithful, especially on major feasts. The collection was given to the cathedral by Bishop Herbert Vaughan, the second Bishop of Salford, and who would later become Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. Bishop Vaughan had amassed the collection over some 30 years. It comprises relics of saints from the early centuries of the church, including the Roman martyrs, through the medieval period, including St. Thomas Becket, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Ursula and St. Elizabeth of Hungary, and even through penal times with relics of St. Thomas More and St. Edmund Campion. This group is likely to be one of the finest and largest collections of relics of any church in the country. In all, there are 75 reliquaries containing a few hundred individual relics between them. It has been kept locked away in the cupboards for most of the last 30 years, so knowledge of it amongst the worshipping community was very limited. Such extensive collections could only be gathered through good contact with the highest authorities in Rome. These collections were gathered together to deliberately reinforce this connection to the church and the saints of the previous centuries, again emphasizing that the faithful were part of this same church. The result of these changes today, then. Every church undergoes change during the decades and centuries of its existence. Salford was no exception. even before the end of the 19th century, with the addition of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel and the early loss of the ornately canopied painting of the Holy Trinity in the 1930s. But the cathedral was subject to both gradual change and a sudden and dramatic adaptation and loss. Arguably, the reorderings were liturgically successful, but they disrupted architectural cohesion of the interior and robbed the building of its finest fixtures. These fixtures and decoration not only provided much of the aesthetic and historical value of the building, they were evidence of how it originally functioned, the entire building serving as a bold statement in re-establishing the identity of the Catholic community at that time, giving them, as I say, the confidence to practice their faith, reinforced by this rich heritage and built upon the example of the saints. With so many of these fixtures lost and the decoration covered over, this Catholic heritage and thus Catholic identity has been obscured and perhaps risks being lost. However, there is hope. In the current period, there is a gradual and growing appreciation of Catholic buildings' heritage, helped by publications such as A Glimpse of Heaven by Christopher Martin in 2006 and 50 Churches to See Before You Die by Elena Curti, published just last year, as well as the Taking Stock initiative between 2005 and last year, which was an architectural and historical review of all the Catholic churches in England and Wales. There is a growing recognition of the damage that was done in many churches through reordering. Also, a greater desire for our churches to be of high quality and coherent in their decoration. Perhaps the beginnings of revisiting these reorderings in a more sympathetic way with work at other churches and cathedrals is beginning to be seen. As mentioned previously, the First World War Centenary Cathedral Fund enabled works to address urgent roof repairs. These were undertaken by Andrew Arrell of Arrell and Snell Architects. This was the first opportunity to begin research of the building and the point at which the scale of these changes could begin to be determined. Since then, some small improvements have been made with the introduction of choir stalls in the choir, just seen to the left here and the right of the altar in the background. Providing an appropriate space for the choristers seated side on so as not to distract from the flow of the actions at Mass, nor to distract from the flow of the building. Some appropriate timber benches have also been added to the aisles, replacing dreaded stacking chairs. There's also been replacement of the Stations of the Cross just last year. The stations installed in the 1980s, seen here top right, were replaced with an alternative set, seen here at the bottom. The originals, top left, from 1855 had been replaced by the modern set during the 1980s, and the modern set never quite suited the Gothic revival interior, so a 19th century set had been sought. This replacement set came from another listed church within the diocese that sadly had to be demolished in the early 2000s. And while not an exact match as the originals, they are the same scale as the originals and with similar oak frames and plaster reliefs. Recognizing the need to ensure an appropriate use for the modern set, which was only replaced when a new home was found, I'm pleased to say that the modern set was donated to a school for the visually impaired located here in the Northwest. The larger-than-life tactile form will allow the pupils to experience them through touch. The school were particularly delighted. As well as plans to recite the Rood Cross back, as well as this, there are plans to recite the Rood Cross back in the crossing arch. It's intended to return the statues of Our Lady and the Infant Christ and St. John to the entrance of the choir. But these initial changes to the cathedral, I think, have made a bit of a difference to the interior. They seem to look far more in keeping now, and they actually take up the exact locations of the original set. The grant-aided conversion work has also been both the catalyst for these small improvements, but also for a larger long-term project of conservation, improvement, and redevelopment of the entire cathedral precinct. At the heart of the project is the conservation and reordering, or re-reordering, of the church interior. As an inner-city parish in an area of substantial residential development, the cathedral is fortunately experiencing a growth in its worshipping community, so increased space for worshippers is suddenly an urgent requirement. There are continuing fabric issues as well as a need for improved facilities for worshippers and visitors, so there is a great opportunity to address this harm that was done in the reordering, in particular of the 1980s, while providing solutions to the practical issues. It is early days yet, with the conservation architect Chris Cotton of Purcell only recently appointed, but the ideas of what might be done to try and improve things aesthetically are being led liturgically, but still informed by sound research of the building and the artists involved in the early decoration, amongst other aspects. The architect Craig Hamilton has previously consulted on initial ideas for the reordering and produced this plan seen here. Looking at the resiting of the principal altar away from the central crossing here, back into the sanctuary area, and providing increased seating, as well as considering the reintroduction of new choir stalls and par-closed screens to close off the sides of the sanctuary, which are currently open and quite easily accessed, even during Mass. There is also an idea to possibly reinstate the par-closed screens of the baptistry in the northwest corner here. As well as this, there is this proposed design for a possible new high altar, which would be Gothic revival in style, of course, but more restrained than the original, allowing the current good view of the east window. But these are just initial thoughts on the potential of the cathedral. Craig Hamilton is actually the one currently engaged in the reordering of Shrewsbury, mentioned at the start of this talk. That too is also a cathedral that has undergone extensive and unsympathetic reordering in the 1980s. This has received some press coverage, as has been alluded to already, and it hopefully does involve the recovery of extensive wall paintings, again by Joseph Pippin, which are completely covered over. There are just a few glimpses that have been uncovered by the conservators at the moment. And there is also a very high quality encaustic tile and marble mosaic floor. The project here at Salford is certainly long-term, but it is being well informed and led by sound, authoritative professionals. If the recovery of some of the important historic and aesthetic details can be achieved, and the appropriate reintroduction of new fixtures and details that draw upon the heritage of the church, incorporated all into this one scheme, then the developments are very exciting. This is an opportunity to improve one of the major Catholic churches in England, and I believe it's an opportunity to help improve the understanding and recognition of Catholic heritage. If this is achieved, I believe it will make Salford Cathedral worthy of Pevsner's comment of it being a large and magnificent building by any standards and one of the most ambitious RC churches of its day. This would truly be a fitting demonstration of Catholic identity. Thank you for your time, and I hope that my talk has been of some interest to you at least, and I hope that my voice didn't drone on too much. But again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to get us back to gallery view and invite anybody who wishes to put your videos on again so we can see your lovely faces. And yeah, bring questions to the floor if you wish. I was particularly amazed really at how the whitewashing of so much woodwork. In fact, I mean, while you could see that obviously there was damage done to the cathedral, but that, you know, the is it Pippin? You mentioned the painters, the paintings in the Holy Rosary altar or something like that, just really become very vivid actually once they're set against the white woodwork. And you know, perhaps I did wonder if there had been what sort of reaction from the congregation you think the cathedral has sort of picked up on over the years in terms of how much attention is drawn to the artworks that remain because of the now rather plain interior.
It's an interesting situation, I think. I mean, I'm very familiar with the cathedral, as I say, not just because of the work I've been involved with for the last 5 years. It's my home cathedral, so you know, I forget what age I was when I first went in, but certainly quite a young child. I suspect possibly before the 1985 reordering, slightly showing my age there, but certainly my memory of it has always been the post 85, 88 reordering, where it was just so stark and white, and you know, marble flooring throughout, and a rather dreadful hospital-looking terrazzo floor throughout most of the nave, which is in desperate need of coming up because it's causing dreadful moisture problems in the stonework. So it's, I think quite often it takes people a little time to spot some of these details within the cathedral. Quite often people come in and make their way directly to the East End, so where the Lady Chapel is. I mean, obviously a big part of that is most Catholics have a great devotion to Our Lady, so it seems to be the you know, one of the major points of call to call on. So, and that is probably the part of the cathedral that shows most of the original carved stonework, fortunately. But I think that they get used to the surroundings, really. So as soon as you walk in, there isn't this wow factor of all this beautiful 19th century stone carving. The only wow factor, I don't really like that phrase so much, but the only impact that you get like that really is from the great east window at the far end, or maybe some of the detailing of some of the statues which are located down the aisles. So you have to sort of explore the space to really spot some of these really fine details. And the Blessed Sacrament, as I say, is really one of the finest parts of the cathedral. So the reaction to these artworks is it quite often takes somebody to maybe guide them around. So I mean, sometimes I've given tours of the cathedral, or some of the members of staff do, or clergy, and they like to point out these, you know, these beautiful painted panels by Pippet, or to Pease there. And you know, to bring people up through the rails into the sort of sanctuary area within the Blessed Sacrament chapel, so they can actually see them close up. And you know, you point out these details and the fact that the theme of them is something that's you know, perhaps not recognized from a distance by Catholics, but when you get close up, you can then, you know, you're told that these are the mysteries of the Rosary, the three of them that were in existence at that time. And all of a sudden they think, oh right, you know, they understand the context of these decorations, which again was perhaps a reminder for people in prayer. We sometimes forget the mysteries of the Rosary, so you have a little reminder there, a prompt, as you know, is quite often seen in some of the stained glass windows. And you know, the saints that you might have a particular devotion to, if you know they're perhaps the same age as you or share your name with them, and it's helping with I think Catholics having a familiarity with the saints, and it all helps to develop their faith. But the reaction when I show these historic images is very interesting, because it's so stark, the difference, I think, between the pre-reordered church and the post-reordered church. But as I say, there's still beauty there in the cathedral. It maybe takes a little bit of finding, or someone with a bit of knowledge to point these things out.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple more questions just come in. Well, a comment from somebody who knew the cathedral in the 60s and 70s. That's nice to hear that. Terence Duffy asks, well, everyone can read this, can't they? James, can you see that in your chat? Quite a long question in a way.
I don't know if I'm still on screen share, by the way.
You are, which maybe
okay.
Feel free to keep it up, and then you can obviously refer to.
Sure, I thought it would be helpful. I can bring up the chats. Yes.
I mean, Terry's, I think, bringing up the point that in the latest proposals, I think by Craig Hamilton, the nave altar moves back again. Now, is that something that is, you know, a desire that's been, you know, shared by all? Is it the clergy moving that way? Is it the hierarchy within the church, or is it? What's your sense of why that?
I'm just trying to get back to the plan. Yeah, just here. Yes, so the altar at the moment is here where the white cursor is. This was just a you know, I suppose initial proposal of what could be done, which would be to site the altar here, so it would still be a forward-facing altar. And there's basically 3 bays to the choir and sanctuary, so it would be within this centre bay, and the original high altar was at this end. It's really been discussion with the architects, the cathedral clergy, those of us involved in the ongoing fabric maintenance of the building on the various committees, as well as some of the parishioners at the cathedral. It's sort of a taboo topic, I think, whenever you talk about looking at reordering, because there's a bit of a trend within the church to kind of harken back with both feet to the pre-Vatican II time, which would mean priests celebrating Mass with the back to the people, Mass in Latin, which is done in a number of places now, and priests are free to celebrate Mass that way. But this isn't coming at it from that angle at all. It's really coming at it primarily from the angle of trying to provide more seating space within the cathedral, but also one of the things that you don't really get the impression from the photographs is when you come into the cathedral and you actually walk down to where the sanctuary is within the crossing. It's, in terms of the pew space, it's almost like an average sized church. The space for the worshippers. I mean, we can fit extra seating and things like that for major celebrations, but basically the nave is shorter than the sanctuary, which just doesn't look right at all. I mean, perhaps if a church is originally designed that way, maybe it would work, but the reordering just didn't seem to work aesthetically, architecturally with the historic buildings. So the idea really is to try and go back some way and not quite be as drastic, and really to have some of the carved decoration as influences we can call upon is one particular idea that we have. Whether there would be a high altar put in, my personal opinion is I doubt it. I think it would be a forward-facing altar, which would be the principal altar for all masses, and then something would be done. The tabernacle would be kept where the high altar has always been, which is really like most Catholic churches anyway. But something definitely needs to be done around there, because it's almost just like a plain wall with very little carved decoration. There are 4 carved panels with the emblems of the evangelists located to either side of the tabernacle. But yeah, it's I mean, it will be something, because as I say, it's early days. It will be something that the options will be put so people can share in what the thinking is so far, because it's the people's cathedral. It's it's the community that built it, it's the community that worship in it, it's the community that maintain it. So this is really being done in conjunction with them, hopefully informed by those of us who hopefully have a bit of knowledge of the historic details and everything, to try and present how things were to them and see what they like, really.
Yeah. Speaking of knowledgeable people, there's a question about what the Victorian Society might think about. Do you happen to know what their views are on how, the question is how the internal fabric should be enhanced to reflect its heritage and counter the harm done by past reorderings?
They are starting to be consulted. There's been a little bit of delay over the last 14 months. I think we all know why. But even during the COVID period, we've had the appointment of the conservation architect, Chris Cotton of Purcell. So as I say, it's really just a project that's getting started. Craig Hamilton's involvement goes back a number of years. It was just, I think, an initial conversation, and then looking at what potential there could be, because I think the original idea was just to move the altar back to the sanctuary, and it was as simple as that. But I think that I mean, I do have a lot of contact with the Victorian Society, primarily in my role with the Historic Churches Committee of Wales. So my impression is that it is something that they would be quite supportive of, as long as it is done in a particularly sensitive way, particularly sensitive to the historic fabric that's already there, and the restoration of materials, the restoration of fixtures. I think so long as it isn't just carbon copies of original features, I think it has to be new work, but in the style of the traditional sense of building that was seen throughout the Gothic revival.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's of course what Craig Hamilton is so good at. He's made a
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I suspect he is a name that his is a name that many of you are familiar with. But if not, do have a look at some of his work. He's done some wonderful private chapels throughout the country. Craig Hamilton Architects, all in the classical style. So Gothic is perhaps a little bit of a departure for him, but the initial drawings were spectacular. And I mean, when I sort of started working in this field, to see work like that, it was a real eye opener. To think that somebody was actually designing in such a high quality, traditional way, which looked as though some of the work had come off the pages of architecture books from centuries before. So, yeah.
I have one more question, if I may. It was just that on the likelihood of restoring any of the wall paintings that have been uncovered.
Yes. Here, yeah, it would be a very big job, obviously, because the paintwork is extensive. The whitewash, virtually, I think originally when it was done, it was sort of 3 shades of mushroom. It's been toned down a little bit now, and it's a little bit more like whitewash and perhaps magnolia. So it would be really extensive. I think practically, probably the only way something like this could be approached is obviously a selective investigation. I mean, this is pretty conclusive. It does look very blurred just because of the quality of the image, but the best quality image that I could get, you could just about see bishops of Mercia, and then you start to see Diuma, and forgive the pronunciation of my English of the period, Keola, I think, and Yarraman is another one. Trumer and Yarraman. So I'm sure there are experts that would do a much better job amongst us than me. So I think targeted investigation would be ideal, but because it covers the spandrels of the arcade as well, it's really extensive. And I think the crucial bit would be to see, well, okay, how did they address the period between the Reformation and the re-establishment of the church? I mean, that's conjecture, I suppose, on my part, but just seeing that it does continue along here, it seems to make sense, especially with references to Bishop Sharples, who was the coadjutor for the area before the first bishops of Salford in the mid-19th century. So there is a sort of first step back towards that pre-restoration period. So it would be fascinating if it is a sort of continuous line. Okay, there were periods where there was a bit of a gap, but to have this continuation of names, I think it's such a bold statement. I was gobsmacked, I think, when I suddenly discovered this, because it's, the East Window is a really bold statement of Catholic identity, I think. And then something like this, it's, I mean, I think perhaps a parallel is quite often when you go into the really historic Anglican cathedrals, there's mention of, continuous Christian worship for however many centuries. And there is this continuation of bishops pre-Reformation right up to post-Reformation to the present day. I think then to have the Catholic version of that, perhaps slightly controversial in some circles, but I think it's a wonderful demonstration of the artistry of the time, but also this incredible confidence that just suddenly sprang up overnight, really, with the huge increasing numbers of the community.
Sure, yeah, thank you. We've got a couple more questions. I think I'll take this one that came in first, I think, from Jane Walsh, saying the hidden gem, also by Hadfield, seems to have retained its rich decoration. Why would that be when St. John's didn't?
So I'm just going back to it here. Here's the hidden gem on the right. Quite rightly, also by Hadfield, and so different, I think, to St. John's Cathedral, even though the two were built in the same decade. Why did it retain its features? I suppose quite simply, I suspect a lot of you won't know the hidden gem. It's definitely worth a visit, and it's a stone's throw from Albert Square, where the town hall is. So it's well signposted as well. The doors are always open, and there's a very nice priest there as well, I must say that. I think probably because as soon as you go in, the elaborate reredos, which is over 20 foot tall with almost life-size statues on it. I'm only sorry I don't have a picture of the interior. I think because it's such a work of art, and that was the thing to see really when you go in the church. I think the big difference with Salford Cathedral is that because the high altar stood in the way of the window, I think that was really the main thing that sealed its fate. There's been one or two suggestions that it was perhaps unsteady, there'd been movement or something like that, but this could have been rectified. We weren't talking about a building. Okay, it was 34 foot high, but it could quite easily have been rebuilt, I think, or repaired if that was the case. So I think that it was just a statement to try and improve the view of the east window, which for some reason was regarded as finer craftsmanship or a finer piece of art. There seems to be no rhyme or reason in a lot of cases with why some churches were so drastically reordered and others had such a light touch. I mean, the two reorderings at the cathedral, you had this initial one, which, as I say, just basically created a sanctuary in the crossing and left everything else virtually intact, which in a lot of cases is what was done. But for some reason, you then get these second reorderings that I think seem to, I don't know, maybe try and make the new sanctuary or the new fittings more appropriate by, I think it was sort of seen as removing clutter. So they wanted more of a stark interior, so the new furnishings matched maybe. Or quite simply, it could have just been down to the tastes of the parish priest or the community at the time. These were the changes that were coming in, and the priest thought, well, we just need a forward-facing altar. I mean, there were some that were reordered very late. I think some of them into the 90s. So it's, yeah.
Good question, hard to answer.
Yes, definitely.
Martin Crampin, who's with us, has a question.
Well, Martin.
Yeah. Your narrative is mainly of loss of this Victorian material, which is fine. But the thing that really struck me is that the loss actually reveals the east window, which, and I don't know if you can go back to that original picture and see how much you could see before, but the lower reaches you can't see, and that really wonderful story that is in the bottom panels of this history, which you talked about, which actually you couldn't see before. And now, so it's almost like I know you have to understand the east window in the context of what's in front of it, but in a way it's kind of been given back to the cathedral. And I must say, it's a bit of a shame that they might take it away if you put a big altar up in front of it. But it just struck me as kind of, it's the opposite way round, that this kind of wonderful piece of Victorian art kind of comes back when everything else is swept away.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Martin. I agree with you. It's really hard to see. I presume I'm still on screen share. The high altar is just about here, and you can just about make out some of the colour of the window. There aren't really any particularly good pictures that show it, I think, because the tracery is so open and there were no backs behind where the statues were, so you still got a sense of some of the colour and detail coming through, but it would have obscured a considerable amount of the window. And I think with it being such a large window, it quite clearly needed to be read at quite some distance. The only place you can actually see it, you can see it now, of course, now the high altar's not there, but previously the only place you could see it in full would have been in the Lady Chapel behind the high altar. And it's almost overpowering because if I just go to the plan back here, here you have the chantry chapels either side. This is the Lady Chapel. So the east window is just here, and this is where the high altar was. So, you've one bay width away from the window, so you really have to sort of crane your neck up. Okay, you can see all the legends and you can figure out who each of the saints are, and you can read each of the bottom panels very clearly, and the view of the window is very good. but you just wouldn't have got that with the high altar in place, even though, you know, it was fairly open, as I say. So I think that would probably be the most tricky bit of the whole project to get right, really, because there's no way really something like this could go back. One, financially, it would just be crippling to the whole project, I think, to produce something so ornate in such good quality materials. Especially if it's not going to be the principal altar. It would only be used if ever there was, you know, mass with the back to the people, which I doubt would happen very often at all. So it's, sorry, I'm just trying to get to the image that Craig did this. Again, you can see that it does cut off part of the window. The screens either side are still there. So you do miss a little bit of the window. It's hard to switch back to the other picture. So I think this was probably about as high as Craig thought it was appropriate to go, but this would really have to have very careful consideration. But there's certainly scope to do something up to this level where the screen is, which just brings some focus to this area, drawing the eye towards the tabernacle here. I mean, the altar underneath, which there was no need really for this to come out, other than the fact that it would have meant having two altars within the church, but there's already a Blessed Sacrament altar in the south transept. There's an altar in the War Memorial Chapel. There's the Holy Rosary altar in the north transept. So that, I don't think that would really have been an issue today, but that's gone completely. As I say, you can just about see it here. So the screen does come up a fair way, and it does actually blot out that lower level of the window at the moment. So it will take a lot of careful consideration and much consultation with Victorian Society and various other interested bodies. But I think most crucially with the worshipping community of both the cathedral and the wider diocese. I can just go back to the window. It's such a beautiful window, I can't help but bring it up. Yeah, this is the lower section of the panels here with that wonderful sort of storyboard.
Is there anything else by Wales in the church? Did they do any other windows?
Yes, not according to the guidebooks and the Pevsner guide, but I'm fairly certain that Wales also did the windows of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. The colour tone looks spot on with the east window, as well as that this was originally the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. So after the sanctuary, this was the most important part of the cathedral. So the idea that this would have been equally, you know, richly decorated rings true, I think, and he was the one doing the windows at the time. Slightly after the Wales window came some Hardman windows in the chantry chapels, which you can just about see one here through the tracery. I think there's less than 10 years between the Hardman windows and the Wales windows, but interestingly, the Wales windows haven't suffered from any major paint loss. I mean, there's been a couple of small sections of glass that have been damaged over the years, but the paint quality is really superb considering its age, 170 years nearly. But the Hardman windows have had a considerable amount of paint loss. I know there was the issue of the borax problem with stained glass at that period, so I think it was just before Hardman's was sort of starting to get that process right. So sadly, there's two Hardman windows in each of the chantry chapels, and all four of them have sort of equal amounts of paint loss. There is a window that I neglected to include, to my shame, which actually has a portrait of Hadfield and Goldie as the architect of the church and the architect of the high altar, and they are just in front of their namesake saints, and St. John the Evangelist is in the centre holding a model of the cathedral. That too, similar sort of colour tone and high quality paint detail match in the east window. So I suspect that also is a William Wales window. But I know a little bit about stained glass, but I'm certainly no expert. That's just my hunch, shall we say. Like my Capit hunch is.
Easy to recognise, so send it over, I'll look at it.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you, Martin. Do we have any more questions before we finish? Francis?
Thank you. Thank you, James. That was a truly poignant lecture, this adaptation and loss, and also the emphasis on the need to reassert the Catholic identity, these tensions throughout. I don't think I've ever heard a story quite like it, so amazing. And thank you for all your erudition that was behind it. I couldn't help feeling that you didn't mention the Clean Air Act, which for industrial cities was a hugely significant change, and how many people must have felt that that whiteness, that sudden space and openness was somehow truly modern and something they wanted, and one could understand why, and the knocking down of terraced houses and so on. And so that sort of pull of the modernity somehow came through in some of your slides, though your account of the loss was so tremendous and so huge that one sort of began to think, well, yes, of course, there's a problem. You know, how does one connect the past with the present, and also for the future, of course? Very difficult. And I found the whole thing absolutely riveting, lots of unanswered questions and so on. But the final slide, I think, of the drawing of what you will replace with the new altar did seem slightly to deny the 21st century. And I wondered if there was a possibility of such an exquisite architect being made to think again, or perhaps have another shot. Anyway, but it was just a sudden closing in. All churches are organic because they're not museums. They live in the present, and they have a life that changes as you know, the life outside the building changes too, and we have to acknowledge that. So it was such a fascinating exploration of the tensions between architecture and liturgy and the liturgical movement and so on, as you said. Could I just ask, will you be changing the lighting? Because the really upsetting thing was the glaring lights in the modern period, whether it's the first or second more recent readaptation. And those are presumably your carvings. I'm sorry, you must have explained that and I missed the point until I saw the same name that you did for the church, is it? Those ones?
No, sadly,
Oh.
no, I'm not particularly artistic. No, it was just my photograph, that's all. I was trying to put the credits for each of the photographs up. No, I've not been able to determine who the artist of the stations were. It was something I was hoping to do.
Not the stations, but the one above, it says James, or is that Crowley?
Yes.
That's not yours then?
No, this one, this carving here.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, this was one of the modern stations of the cross. No, it's not my carving. It's just my photograph. Yeah, as I say, I wasn't able to determine who the artist was. I did know where they came from. They came from the teacher training college at Hopwood Hall near Middleton, just outside Manchester, and it was the chapel there, which I think was by Frederick Gibbard, and I think it was a forerunner of the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool. Yeah. Not quite circular, but I think it's octagonal in shape. It's a really striking building and one that I'd love to get into, but I think it's been difficult since it's become a sixth form college, and I think the chapel's now a library or something like that.
But finally, also just you did mention the 1990s carving or civic artwork, you called it, which looked like
yes,
outside the East End, wasn't it? The rather interesting sort of piece.
Yeah, here we are. Yeah, just here. Outside the East End. Yeah, it was installed in 1992. I'm not sure who the artist is, but they did, as I say, the planners at the time did go to a bit of trouble. So they've actually created, I think it's referred to as St. John's Square or Cathedral Square or something like that at the back. I mean, there's no direct access from the cathedral grounds to there. It's really just a pedestrianised street and then sort of 3 or 4 story apartment buildings around there. So it's I think perhaps one of the plans might show just here. Here's the cathedral. The square is just at the back here, so you can actually see the buildings sort of reflect, you know, this sort of T shape. So you can actually get views from the street at the back here. And this pedestrian street is quite nice. It's tree lined. It's a bit treacherous during the autumn, but it's quite nice. And the other big thing is, of course, there's to the geographic west side of the cathedral, so outside the north side, confusingly, it's complete green space, not particularly well landscaped, just here and here, and perhaps better here, but there was a bit of an effort made. So it's kind of I think guaranteed the views of the cathedral at this side. The buildings locally did actually abut the cathedral at this side, so views are actually quite poor up until the 1990s, when you know, the sort of housing clearance continued to the buildings that were here. I think there was a technical college on this site. Everything was, I think, 20th century, or, you know, there was maybe the odd 19th century industrial building on site, you know, interestingly historically, but gone many years now.
If I can throw in one tiny thing, I was reminded by your talk of how everybody put sheets of plywood over their door panels and over their staircases, so it looked boxed. They boxed them in, so it looked modern. And then a younger generation came in and ripped them all out because they were way out of date. So
yeah, I've done a couple of those myself. Yeah, I really appreciated your point, Francis, just going back to the Clean Air Act. Very good point that I hadn't really considered with this. And I think the point that you were making as well about the final drawing and this sort of harkening back to an old style, I think the most important aspect of it is it has to be of its time. So it's, I mean, I wouldn't like to be the one, you know, holding the pen designing this, because I think it just has to be perfect, really. It's not going to please everyone, I'm sure, but I think there is great potential to introduce something that's modern, but is still respectful of the heritage of the building.
Very difficult, but yes, that would be one's hope. Yeah.
I'm starting to think of the architect George Pace, who I think is a little bit like Marmite to a lot of people.
Not to me. I think he's wonderful.
Oh, I do too. His church on Coney Street in York is one that I got very familiar with when I was studying there, because it was a church I had to do a talk on once. So it's yeah.
Merge the international style of the modern movement with arts and crafts, doesn't he? The two things, the arts and crafts there as well as the 20th century modern. It's a very clever thing.
Yeah, and he's almost like an enigma. I think he's you know, he's certainly somebody I think that you know, requires a lot of study, I think, for those of us that work in this field, because I personally quite like his work.
There are, I don't know if you can still see them, but the son of George Pace has given a talk not that long ago for the 20th Century Society. So maybe, I was going to say we could do one, but it has already been done. You know?
Oh, terrific.
We must have a trip to Salford, Laura.
Yeah, I think a trip might be on the cards. Particularly, one thing we haven't mentioned at the Hidden Gem is the incredible Stations of the Cross there by Norman Adams, and they're certainly, perhaps we could do both.
Yeah, definitely.
A day out of Manchester.
Yeah, it's, I mean, they're really striking, and I think, maybe to use the phrase again, a little bit like Marmite, people seem to love them or hate them. I think that they do add something to the church. I mean, such a departure to the originals, but certainly really good quality. And there's a particular, I think, thanks to the previous parish priest was there, Canon Dennis Clinch. He was a great lover of the arts, really. So the church has this sort of tradition of good artworks there. So Yeah, wonderful place, and I can only but recommend the glories of the Northwest, Salford before Manchester, of course.
Great. Well, if Boris's roadmap all goes to plan, then we shall be
Fingers crossed.
making it soon. That'd be wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think we probably ought to call it a day there. I should have said at the beginning, a happy Ascension Day to everybody. I'm sorry that we planned this event for Ascension Day. That was entirely my fault. We were going for Thursdays fortnightly, which made it nice and regular. But I overlooked the fact that some people might be actually at church. Anyway, happy Ascension Day, and thank you again for joining us. Do please think about whether you might join us in a fortnight's time on a Thursday again for Dominic Wilkinson's talk about the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool, which of course is an absolute treasure trove of incredible works of art, 20th century ones of course, but that should be a good talk. And then Martin, who's been asking questions this evening, is also giving a talk for us in early June on the tiles of St David's Cathedral in Wales. So do think about joining us for those, but thank you again for joining us tonight, and thank you to James. We'll say goodbye. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Mm.